Good afternoon, everyone. And Steve, thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you to you and to CEDA for the invitation to speak to you today. It's a great pleasure for me to be back here in Adelaide and to participate in another CEDA event. CEDA does fantastic work, and I'm very glad to be able to support it, so thank you. Those of you who follow the RBA closely would have noticed frequent references to the labour market in our recent communication. So today I'd like to explain why we've been doing this, and also to discuss how we think about spare capacity in the labour market. And then I'll finish with some comments about monetary policy. Those of you who are students of central bank history, and I hope there are at least a few in the room, would be aware that the Reserve Bank Act was passed by the Australian Parliament in 1959, so that's 60 years ago now. In terms of monetary policy, the Parliament set three broad objectives for the Reserve Bank Board. It required the Board to set monetary policy so as best contribute to 1, the stability of the currency, 2, the maintenance of full employment, and 3rd, the economic prosperity and welfare of the people of Australia. These objectives have remained unchanged since 1959. Here in Australia, we did not follow the fashion in many other countries over recent decades to set just a single objective for the central bank, that's inflation control. And in my view, it was very sensible not to follow this fashion. Our legislated objectives, having 3 elements, are broader than the objectives of many other central banks. The third of our 3 objectives does serve as a constant reminder to us that the ultimate objective of our policies is the collective welfare of the people of Australia, and that's important. From an operational perspective, as Steve said, the flexible inflation target is the centrepiece of our monetary policy framework. The target, which has been agreed with successive governments, is to deliver an average rate of inflation over time of 2 to 3%. Our focus is very much on the average and on the medium term. Inflation averaging 2-point-something constitutes a reasonable definition of price stability. And achieving this stability helps with achieving our other objectives. Low and stable inflation is a precondition to the attainment of full employment, and it promotes our collective welfare. As I've said on other occasions, we're not targeting inflation because we're some form of inflation nutters. Rather, we're doing so because delivering low and stable inflation is the most effective way for Australia's central bank to promote our collective welfare. So where does the labour market fit into all of this? And the answer is that it's central to all 3 of our objectives. The connection with the second objective, full employment, is, I hope, obvious. The RBA is seeking to achieve the lowest rate of unemployment that can be sustained without inflation becoming an issue. In doing this, one of the questions we face at the moment is what constitutes full employment in our modern economy where work arrangements are much more flexible than they once were. I'm going to return to this issue in a moment. The labour market is, of course, also central to our 3rd objective, our collective welfare. It's perhaps stating the obvious to say that for many Australians, having a good job at a decent rate of pay is central to their economic prosperity. Trends in the labour market also have a major bearing on inflation outcomes, so they're critical to our first objective. Over time, there's a close link between wages growth and inflation, and a critical influence on wage outcomes is the balance between supply and demand in the labour market, or in other words, how much spare capacity is there in the labour market at a given point in time. This question is obviously closely to the one about what constitutes full employment. So all this means that it's natural that the board of the RBA to focus heavily on the labour market as it makes its monthly decisions about interest rates, and we've certainly been doing that recently. With that background, I'd like to discuss how we assess the degree of spare capacity in the Australian labour market at the moment. And I want to do this from 4 perspectives. The first is the rates of unemployment and underemployment. The second is the flexibility of the supply side of the labour market. The third is the effectiveness with which people are matched with job vacancies. and the fourth is trends in wages. So they're the four perspectives I'm going to take. So first to unemployment and underemployment. The conventional measure of spare capacity in the labour market is the gap between the actual unemployment rate and the unemployment rate associated with full employment. As my colleague Lucy Ellis discussed last week, we don't directly observe the unemployment rate associated with full employment, so we need to estimate that. Over recent times, though, there's been a gradual accumulation of evidence to suggest that the estimates are lower than we previously thought. While it's not possible to pin down the number exactly, the evidence is consistent with an estimate below 5%, perhaps around 4.5%. And given that the current unemployment rate is 5.2%, this suggests pretty clearly that there is still spare capacity in our labour market. The fact that the conventional estimate of spare capacity is based on the unemployment rate reflects an implicit assumption that if you have a job, you're pretty much fully employed. In decades past, this might have been a reasonable assumption. But it's not a realistic assumption in today's modern flexible labour market, so we need a broader measure of spare capacity. As more and more of us have worked part-time, it's become increasingly common to be both employed and to work fewer hours than you want to work. As you can see here in my first chart, in the 1960s, less than 1 in 10 workers worked part-time. Today, 1 in 3 of us work part-time. And as you can see in the top line there, almost 1 in 2 women work part-time, and more than 1 in 2 younger workers work part-time. These are big changes. A few more facts are perhaps helpful here. According to the ABS, around 3 million people work part-time because they want to, not because they can't find a full-time job. Most people who are working part-time do so because they're studying, or they have caring responsibilities, or for other personal reasons. So we shouldn't think of part-time jobs as being bad jobs and full-time jobs as being good jobs. Rather, one of the great successes of the Australian labour market is that we have been able to accommodate this desire for part-time work and greater flexibility. Having said that, around 1/4 of people working part-time are not satisfied with the hours that they're working, and they'd like to work more hours. And you can think of these people as being underemployed. As is evident in this chart, the share of part-time workers who are underemployed moves up and down from year to year, but the current share is above the average of the past 2 decades. You can see that in the top panel here. As part of the ABS's monthly survey of 50,000 people, it asks underemployed workers how many extra hours they would like to work. And that, as you can see in the bottom panel here, on average, these underemployed workers say they would like another 14 hours per week. It's interesting to point out that this figure has trended down over the past 2 decades. It used to be around 16 hours a week. And over the same time period, the average hours worked by part-time workers has increased by around 2 hours to 17 hours a week. And taken together, these data do suggest that businesses are doing a better job of providing the hours that part-time workers want. This shift to part-time work means that in assessing spare capacity, we need to consider measures of underemployment as well as measures of unemployment. And the RBA has been doing this for some time. As part of our efforts in this area, we've constructed a measure of underutilisation that takes account of part-time workers who want more hours. You can see this measure in this chart. It adds the extra hours sought by these workers to the hours sought by those who are unemployed. These extra hours sought by part-time workers are equivalent to around 3.3% of the labour force, which, taking account of the conventional measure of unemployment, means the underutilisation rate is 8.1%. This hours-based measure of underemployment is preferable to the heads-based measure, which often gets public attention, as the heads-based measure treats an unemployed person in the same way as it treats a part-time person seeking a few more extra hours. As you can see in this chart, unlike the unemployment rate, which has trended down over the past 20 years, the underemployment rate has been pretty stable. And these different patterns in unemployment and underemployment suggest that fewer inroads have been made into spare capacity in the labour market than suggested by looking at the unemployment rate alone. And this is something that we've been thinking about in terms of monetary policy recently. There is, though, one other perspective on underemployment that I'd like to share with you. In the past, when part-time work was not readily available, many people, and that's mostly women, faced the choice of taking full-time employment or no paid employment at all. Many chose to, or had to, stay outside the labour force because working wasn't a realistic option when the only option was full-time work. From the perspective of society as a whole, this was a serious form of underutilisation. It just wasn't measured as such by the ABS. Today, people do have more options than they had before, and many people are choosing to join or to defer leaving the labour force because they have the flexible options. From the perspective of adding to the productive capacity of the nation, this is a really good outcome. And if there were a measure of underutilisation that took account of exclusion from the workforce, it surely would have declined over recent decades. I don't want to downplay the issue of underemployment because it's a serious issue, but it is worth recognising the broader perspective and remembering where we've come from. This naturally brings me to my second window into spare capacity in the labour market, and that's the flexibility of labour supply. Over the past 2.5 years, the working age population in Australia has increased at an annual rate of around 1.75%. Over that same time period, employment has increased at an average rate of 2.75%. It's quite a gap. The fact that employment has been growing considerably faster than the working age population has led to a reduction in the unemployment rate, as you would expect. But the reduction is not as large as we might have expected. And the reason for this is that the supply of labour has increased in response to stronger demand for workers. This flexibility in labour supply is evident in this next chart, which shows the substantial rise in labour force participation. Right today, the participation rate is 66%, which is the highest it's ever been. Reflecting this, the share of the working age population in Australia with a job is around the record high that was reached at the peak of the resources boom. This is a significant achievement. As I discussed a few moments ago, the availability of part-time and flexible work is one reason for this. There are two groups for which the rise in participation has been particularly pronounced, and they are women and older Australians. So you can see in this next chart, the female participation rate has risen substantially. Female participation now stands at around 61%. That's up from 43% in the late 1970s. Australia's female participation rate is now above the average of the OECD, although it remains below that in a number of countries, including Canada and the Netherlands. The participation rate of older workers has also increased over recent decades as health outcomes have improved and changes have been made to retirement incomes policies. And these changes are contributing to higher participation of older workers. Another source of potential labour supply is net overseas migration. As is evident here, migration, including temporary skilled workers, increased sharply during the resources boom when demand for skilled workers was very strong, and it subsequently declined. While migrants add to both demand and supply in the economy, they can be a particularly important source of capacity and resolving pinch points when the economy is operating at a high level and there is a shortage of particular skills. The ability to tap into overseas workers can be particularly important in adding to supply. A related source of flexibility stems from our unique relationship with New Zealand. When labour demand in Australia is relatively strong, there tends to be an increase in the net inflow of workers from New Zealand, and when conditions here are weak, the reverse is true. During the resources boom, the inflow of workers across the Tasman was as important as the inflow of temporary skilled workers from the rest of the world. So the overall picture here is one of flexibility on the supply side of the labour market. When the demand for labour is strong, more people enter the market and other people delay leaving. And the rise in participation is a very positive development. But it is one of the factors that has meant that strong demand for labour has not put much upward pressure on wages over recent times, and I'll come back to that in a moment. A third perspective on spare capacity can be gained by examining how well people looking for jobs are matched with the jobs that are available. Looking at the labour market from this perspective, things look a little tighter than suggested by the other two perspectives that I've just spoken about. Currently, almost 60% of firms report that the availability of labour is either a minor or major constraint on their businesses. As you can see here, this share is not as high as it was during the resources boom, but it is still quite high. Reports from the RBA's liaison program suggest there are currently shortages of certain types of engineers, workers with specialised IT skills, and some tradespeople associated with public infrastructure work. And businesses in regional areas are also more likely to report to us that they have difficulty in finding suitable labour. One contributing factor here is the underinvestment in staff training. In the shadow of the global financial crisis, many firms did cut back training in an effort to save costs. I think we're now seeing the evidence of some of the longer-term adverse effects of that. As the labour market tightens, I would hope we'd see more firms prepared to hire workers and provide the necessary training. Another lens on job matching is the ratio of the number of unemployed people to the number of job vacancies. As you can see in this chart, at present there are fewer than 3 unemployed people for each job vacancy in Australia. This compares with over 20 people for each job vacancy in the early 1990s recession and 5 people for every vacancy in 2014. So from this perspective, the labour market does look reasonably tight. There's also some tentative evidence that on average, unemployed workers are not as well matched to job vacancies as they were a decade ago when the ratio of the two was similar to what it is now. One such piece of evidence is that as the unemployment rate has come down over recent years, there has been little progress on reducing very long-term unemployment, defined as those who are unemployed for more than 2 years, and you can see that here. Addressing the causes of this chronic unemployment remains a very important challenge for our community. More positively, as you can see in this chart, the share of the labour force that's been unemployed between 1 and 2 years has trended down over recent times, and that's a positive development. A final lens on job matching and the overall tightness of the labour market is the rate of job mobility. That's how often people are changing their jobs. And here the evidence is quite interesting. Despite the frequent reports of lack of job security and the regular job switching by millennials, the average time that workers are staying with an employer is increasing. Reflecting this, the share of employed people who switch employers in a given year is the lowest it's been in many years. Looking at the data by occupation, the rate of job mobility is lowest for managers and business professionals and highest for tradespeople and workers in the hospitality industry. In a tight labour market, we would expect to see either strong wages growth or frequent job changing as businesses seek out workers. But at the moment, we're seeing neither of these things. One possible explanation for this is the uncertainty that many people feel about the future. This uncertainty means that if you have a job, you want to keep it rather than take a risk with a new employer. And this might be especially so if you have a large mortgage. So it's quite possible that the high level of household debt is affecting our labour market dynamics. I want to now turn to the fourth perspective on labour market tightness, and that's wages growth. Over the past year, wages growth has picked up as the labour market tightened, and that's not surprising given the strength of labour demand. But as you can see here, the pickup has been fairly modest, and it's only evident in the private sector. Over the past year, the private sector wage price index increased by 2.4%, and that's up from 1.9% the previous year. The past 2 quarters have, however, seen lower wage increases than in the previous 2 quarters, and I would not like to see this pattern continue. In contrast to trends in the private sector, wages growth in the public sector has been steady at around 2.5%, as you can see. This largely reflects the various public sector wage caps. It's also worth pointing out that overall wage growth in New South Wales and Victoria has been running at just 2.5%, despite the unemployment rate in those states being a bit below 4.5% on average over the past year. Another perspective on wages growth is from the National Accounts, which reports average earnings per hour worked. As is evident here, this measure is quite volatile, but the latest data again pointed a fairly weak picture, with average hourly earnings in Australia increasing by just 1% over the past year. That's a very soft outcome. In summary, the overall picture from these various windows into the labour market is that despite the strong employment growth over recent times, there is still considerable spare capacity in the labour market. We remain short of the unemployment rate associated with full employment. There's significant underemployment, and there's further potential for labour force participation to rise when the jobs are there. And consistent with all this, wages growth remains modest, and it's below the rate that would ensure that inflation is comfortably within the 2 to 3% target range. The one caveat to this assessment is the difficulty that some firms are having finding workers with the necessary skills, and to my mind this underlines the importance of workplace training. I would like to finish now with a few words on monetary policy. As you're aware, the Reserve Bank Board reduced the cash rate to 1.25% at its meeting earlier this month, and this adjustment was the first one in nearly 3 years. This decision was not in response to a deterioration in the economic outlook since the previous update we published in early May. Rather, it reflected a judgment that we could do better than the path that we look to be on. The analysis that I've shared with you today supports the conclusion that the Australian economy can sustain a higher rate of employment growth and a lower unemployment rate than previously thought likely. Most indicators suggest that there is still a fair degree of spare capacity in the economy. It's both possible and desirable to reduce that spare capacity. Doing so will see more people in jobs, reduce underemployment, and boost household incomes. It will also provide greater confidence that inflation will increase to be comfortably within the medium-term target range. Monetary policy, of course, is one way of helping us get onto this better path. The decision earlier this month will assist us here. It will support the economy through its effect on the exchange rate by lowering the cost of finance and by boosting disposable incomes. In turn, this will support employment growth and inflation consistent with the target. It would, however, be unrealistic to expect that lowering interest rates by just 1/4 of a percentage point will materially shift the path that we look to be on. The most recent data, including the GDP and labour market data, do not suggest we are making any inroads into the economy's spare capacity. Given this, the possibility of lower interest rates remains on the table. It's not unrealistic to expect a further reduction in the cash rate as the board seeks to wind back spare capacity in the economy and to deliver inflation outcomes in line with the medium-term target. It's important, though, to recognise that monetary policy is not the only option, and there are limitations to what can be achieved. As a country, we should also be looking at other ways of getting closer to full employment. One option is fiscal policy, including through spending on infrastructure. Another is structural policies that support firms expanding, investing, innovating and employing people. Both of these options need to be kept in mind as the various arms of public policy seek to maximise the economic prosperity of the people of Australia. So thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to answering your questions after lunch. Thank you.